think he's indicative of a deeper issue, and it's too easy to make him the boogeyman without unpacking what's really going on. And it's important to keep in mind that yes, what he said was racist, for instance. Excuse me. But what's more important is that his appeal worked, right? What's more important is that there was a growing latent racism in Israeli society, of which Netanyahu is just the symbol, and maybe a catalyst in certain circumstances for it. But I think it shines a greater light on some of the things I've been talking about before, the problems of trying to create a Jewish state in a multi-ethnic area, and what that means to people who aren't Jewish. And his statement about there will never be a Palestinian state, I mean, anyone who follows what we refer to, quote unquote, as the peace process over the last, decade plus, can't be surprised by that statement. He was just being honest, He was only saying what deep down I think we all on some level knew, that he had no intention of creating a Palestinian state. He never did. That this peace process wasn't about a real two-state solution. It was about one state, the Jewish state, and this other entity that Israel had ultimate control over, but didn't really resemble any state that you and I would reasonably call a state. So he was only saying out loud in a moment of desperation, I think, the truth of the situation. And I think that really woke up a lot of people. And it seems to have woken up our president, based on his rhetoric over the last few days. I think this may be a personality thing between Obama and Netanyahu, or it may signal a more fundamental shift in our country's approach to its dealings with Israel. I think we're far away from the S part of DDS, and our country leveling sanctions against Israel. However, I think we're at a point in history where the strategic usefulness of this country, of this longtime ally, is being questioned in very public ways, in very unprecedented ways, I find. And that it has given, I think, a real boost to the BDS movement, because I think people are looking to alternate forms of pressure to bring a recalcitrant regime to account. And BDS is the obvious place to do that. That's the obvious place to throw our support. And I have actually colleagues, rabbinic colleagues, who are attracted to, have been attracted in recent days to Jewish Voice for Peace, which is the Jewish organization that I've been affiliated with for many years. It's the only major Jewish organization that endorses the Palestinian BDS call openly and is involved in various campaigns. I have colleagues who have been uncomfortable with BDS for many of the reasons that I just described, who I have, not many, but few, and a notable number, who said, I'm joining JVP now, because because there's no other way. We need, if this country is not going to pressure Israel to do what it needs to do, we need to participate in creating that pressure ourselves. So I have a tentative hopefulness about where we are at this point in time, but I have no illusions that it's going to be easy. But in the end, I think I know that these movements do work. And all of these movements, including the ones that are now part of history, but that we point to as very real and important moments in history, that there was a time in which it was unthinkable that things would ever change. And I remember, I'm old enough to remember, when I was an undergraduate, it was right in the height of the anti-apartheid movement on campuses. And I remember vividly, I remember having a conversation with my father about the situation, and it was this was before the United States the Congress passed the anti-apartheid bill. South Africa was still considered an important ally of the United States, and there was all this talk of quote-unquote positive engagement, which you often hear vis-a-vis Israel as well these days. And I remember talking to my father and saying, how is this ever going to change? And he said, I don't see this changing in any other way but through horrible bloodshed. And yet it did change. And I think the divestment movement, the nonviolent international resistance movement played a very important role in making that change. there are so many ways in which we could look at the South African example as a way in which the narrative itself changed. You know, that the unthinkable became thinkable in large part because people participated in making that change happen. So it's not a pie-in-the-sky prospect to imagine that happening in Israel-Palestine as well. I think we have historical precedent, and you can't only just look around the room to realize that it is a very real possibility because it's happened before. So I'll end, for those of you who are part of this movement, it's my honor to stand with you, and I look forward to working together with you and finding new and creative ways to, as I said before, to create creative discomfort, to leverage people power, to help change that narrative so that Palestinians and Israelis can have the future together that they deserve in that land. And thank you so much for coming tonight. And I'm happy to take as many questions as we have. So, yes, sir.
Yes, Michael Gillespie with Washington Report on Middle East Affairs. Welcome to Iowa.
Thank you.
And a few weeks ago, Carol Ann Glick, who is a Chicago native and an editor at the Jerusalem Post, wrote a blog post on her blog, and I think perhaps it was also in a column in the Jerusalem Post. She accused Barack Obama of anti-Semitism and claimed that he was mainstreaming Jew hatred in America, which I thought was
Crazy.
remarkable that she would do that.
Yeah.
That anyone would do that. This is a woman who is a former Netanyahu foreign policy advisor, and I was tempted to assume that this is part of much of the politics around the visit to Congress, the election tactics in Israel, and this a great deal of criticism of the president. And I'm wondering if you could. You talked a lot about Israel and BDS, but it seems like to me what we're seeing here that ought to be important to all of us as Americans is all of these things in an American political context. Like, what does all this mean? The speech to Congress, the election tactics, the accusations against the President of the United States. What does all this mean in an American political context?
I think Carol Ann Glick is really sort of an Israeli version of Fox News. You know, seriously. I mean, I think that's the context in which she exists. It's a heavily politicized form of journalism that's focuses on ad hominem attack. I mean, what she said isn't all that different than what we hear people on Fox News saying about Obama and what they've been saying about him for years. I think there's a racist undercurrent to it, and I think it's just a sad reality of the current state of corporate-owned media, that these are the kinds of people who pass as journalists today. It's also important to keep in mind, though, that there are many within Israel in particular. There is a very wide spectrum of journalistic attitudes, and if you read Haaretz, for instance, which is one of the Israeli papers of record, and people like Gidon Levy and others, they really wrote very passionately about, and I think represented a significant portion of the Israeli public that was absolutely mortified by what Netanyahu was doing, which was patently for political purposes. Unfortunately, this section of the Israeli public wasn't enough to elect someone else other than Netanyahu. And my concern in Israel is that it's the Caroline Glicks who are becoming ascendant. I think many of the more progressive voices are throwing up their hands and literally leaving the country, leaving behind a more right-wing nationalistic, far right-wing nationalistic population. What that means in our country, is it's not that inseparable from the far-right backlash against Obama that we've been seeing for many, many years. I think, I think, and this is a whole separate conversation, I suppose, about the political landscape of the United States. I think the Republicans overstepped in this case. I think they overplayed their hand. I think it's becoming more and more apparent that the Republican Party is being overtaken by a strident far-right faction. I think Boehner is completely subservient to them. He went to Israel, recently, and just in the wake of that, there was a Wall Street Journal report. I'm sure some of you read it, that revealed that Israel has been actively spying on the United States to get the upper hand in the Iran negotiations, and Boehner just had complete egg on his face when he was asked questions about the United States, that Israel spying on the United States, and I think it's becoming harder and harder for even mainstream Republicans to justify this behavior of undercutting the sovereignty of their own country. I think the Democrats, I think, are slowly but surely finding the courage of their convictions. Almost 60 Democrats refused to hear Netanyahu, which I think, and I was among those who visited my representative, Jan Schakowsky, and I started saying a few words, and she just stopped me and said, "I'm not going, don't worry." And the fact that that's a significant number, and I think we may be in the midst of a paradigm shift here in the United States. What happens after the election, though, could change that whole calculus. So that's a whole other conversation, I guess. Is that what you mean?
Well, I'm old enough to remember the Civil Rights Movement, and that was a combination of many things, but it included blacks and whites together. And we watched things happen on TV that were horrible, and eventually some laws got changed and written, and things got a little better. Okay? Anyway, my question is are there Israelis who are willing to step out and risk their lives to bring about better conditions for the Palestinians? Is it just the Palestinians? I guess I'm wondering, what I'm really trying to get at is, what is Israel and Palestine? What are they actually doing? Instead of looking at the United States outside, we weren't looking at France or England to come in and deal with our civil rights issues. So I'm wondering, is there a movement in Israel that, is kind of like our civil rights, where we have people that were working together? Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah. I think one place where the comparison with the civil rights movement breaks down is that was a domestically focused movement, and the appeal was really to the rest of the country for support. Whereas the Palestinian call is an international campaign that's looking for support from around the world. So that's an important difference, the way South Africa did, for instance.
White Southerners didn't feel that way. They felt that outsiders were coming in.
Right. And that's what you often hear Israelis say, that you have outsiders who are I hear this criticism myself all the time. But what am I as an American doing meddling in Israeli business? That's a common epithet that's used against people who stand in solidarity, is that you're an outside agitator. So there is in Israel a very small, and I would say embattled, faction who are involved in Palestinians, as Israelis involved in Palestinian solidarity work. It's a very small minority, and I'm not talking about what's often referred to as the Israeli peace movement. I'm talking about Israeli-Palestinian solidarity activists. You know, people like Miko Peled, people like Jeff Halper. There are few and far between. There's a growing number of young soldiers who are refusing, potential soldiers who are refusing to serve by standing in solidarity with Palestinians. They are under intense attack within Israel for taking the stands that they do. In fact, Miko doesn't even live in Israel anymore. There's Yonatan Shapira, who's a friend of mine who comes from a strong military family, who was an elite Apache helicopter fighter pilot who is part of this movement, and he can't set foot in Israel anymore because he'll probably be killed. And so this group of people do exist, but it is enormously difficult for them. And the important thing I think for us to bear in mind is that what's often referred to in Israel as the peace movement is really sort of in a shambles. And the peace movement in the past was largely focused on the concept of coexistence, of Israelis and Palestinians coming together. I think one of the reasons why that movement has failed is because it never really reckoned with the inherent power imbalance between Israelis and Palestinians. Israelis and Palestinians can't ultimately come together as long as Israelis are in the position of power over Palestinians. It's a system, an infrastructural system that needs to be dismantled for true coexistence to happen. That's what we saw in South Africa. You couldn't have a truth and reconciliation movement until apartheid itself was dismantled. It couldn't exist. It's a system of inequity. And I think in Israel we have a system of inequity as well. And the few Israelis who are willing to stand up against it are under very, very harsh, are living through a very harsh reality. And I think ultimately for Palestinians, as I said before, need to lead this movement. It's their liberation. It eventually, hopefully, please God, there will be some kind of truth and reconciliation movement toward coexistence between Israelis and Palestinians, but that can't happen in a current circumstance. It can happen while Israelis are the ones holding the guns on the Palestinians. And I think that's just the hard and brutal reality of the situation. Yes.
Yeah, you might have to move over because that's kind of short.
Thank you for talking, and I appreciate your bravery, in other words, in talking about this. We were talking earlier about non-starters. One of the topics was the right of return. Several of us here have some ongoing conversations, sometimes quite heated, with some very vocal members of the Jewish Federation in town. And I look forward to hearing you talk with them sometime. Hopefully that will happen. But one of the non-starters also that gets brought up is the question is, do you believe that Israel has a right to exist? There's always the question, well, what do you mean by Israel, and what are the borders, and all that kind of stuff. The question I have for you is there a place for a Jewish homeland?
Yes, I would say that there's a place for a Jewish homeland. I think for centuries Jews looked at that land as their homeland. It was largely in a mythic sense. It came from our understanding of the sacred history that's related in the Bible. And we've looked at that place as the birthplace of the Jewish people. But homeland and nation-statism are two very different things. And I think we need to really be careful about our terms. Nation-statism is a modern concept. For centuries of Jewish tradition, Judaism was a diaspora-based, I would argue it still is, a diaspora-based tradition. It emerged after the destruction of the Second Temple. It emerged after the Israelites And then later the Jewish people left that land, settled throughout the diaspora, and were able to create what we know today as Judaism. Looking mythically at that place where we once were as our sacred homeland. But we found our home, and theologically we reconstructed Judaism to reflect this. We saw God was with us wherever we went throughout the diaspora. That's what's kept us alive. That's why Judaism has been able to survive for so long in such harsh circumstances, is that it's really a sort of a sacred survival map for living and understanding that God is with us wherever we go. I mean, I cherish that tradition. So is there a place for a Jewish homeland? Yes. Should Jews be able to go there and even live there? Yes. But that's very different from Jewish political nationalism, which is a concept that emerged in really relatively recently in Jewish history, in the 19th century. It was a latecomer to the nationalism world, and was very much a response not so much to Judaism per se, but a response to the growing nationalisms that were popping up all over the world at the time, and that were largely European in origin. Zionism was a European movement. So, as I said before, one of the tragedies of this is that it sought to create an ethnically Jewish state, exclusively Jewish state, in a historically multi-religious part of the world, and also a part of the land that more peoples than just Jews look to as their homeland. So that, to me, was a recipe for eternal conflict, as I see it. Also, it's very important to keep in mind, and this is something I don't think can be stressed enough, because I don't think people really understand this. When Zionism began, it was very much a minority dissident movement in the Jewish community. It was one of many movements of Jewish modernity, and it was by no means accepted by the Jewish world. In fact, there were many, the majority of the Jewish world rejected the notion of Jewish nationalism, and there were many important Jewish movements. In fact, the Reform movement, the largest liberal Jewish denomination, was anti-Zionist until the founding of the state. And so today, just a few decades later really, we find Judaism and Zionism kind of synonymous with one another. And people just accept that, well, if you're Jewish, you must be a Zionist. And if you're a Zionist, that Zionism is a central part of what it means to be a Jew. But that was not always that way, and it's frankly not that way today. It's important to keep in mind that for centuries of Jewish life, we were able to exist in the diaspora and find meaning in the diaspora. And it's important to keep in mind that Zionism is a European political movement, but it is not the same thing as Judaism. But it's become, for all kinds of political reasons, a kind of litmus test for one's loyalty to the Jewish people in the Jewish community. And so when I get up in front of a Jewish group and say, I'm not a Zionist, people like flinch, it's like I could say I eat pork on Yom Kippur, and probably it would be a lot easier for people than if I said I'm not a Zionist. But saying I'm not a Zionist just means I don't believe in Jewish nation-statism. I think that Jewish nation-statism has caused more problems than it's solved, and that we need to find a more creative solution to some of these issues that Zionism was born to address. So I think it's absolutely valid to look at Israel as that historic Palestine, whatever you want to call that land, as a Jewish homeland, but not at the expense of the people who actually live there. And the final thing I'll say about this business of Israel's right to exist, Israel's the only country where you hear that being bandied about. And I think it's really a result of the insecurity of Zionism and Zionists when it comes to this business of creating Jewish statehood. I think it's built on sand in many ways, and the fact that it's constantly has to insist upon its right to exist, when in fact no political states have a right to exist. I mean, that's, in political theory, there's all kinds of approaches to this, but by and large, nation states exist because might makes right. nation states exist because there is a regime that is able to seize their right to exist through political power, through military power, and their ability to defend a certain piece of land and control and have sovereign control over the people who live in it. But in terms of any inherent right of any one people to a certain piece of land, I think that's a very problematic road to go down. I don't think any country has an inherent right to exist. I think it's better to say, how do we extend rights to all the individuals who live in those lands rather than any kind of collective right of a sovereign nation state. Nations don't have rights, people should have rights. And I think this movement, the BDS movement, is a rights-based movement. All three of those goals are about equal rights for everybody who lives in that land, not just Jews, but everybody. So I would rather shift the focus away from Israel's right to exist to the rights of all who live between the Jordan and the Mediterranean to live equally and with dignity and with civil rights for all. Yes?
You said that very few Israelis were working on the Palestinian cause, and you said it was because, I think you said it was harsh. What do you mean by that? Are you saying that Israel would arrest, kill? What do they do to Israelis that stand up?
Well, I can give you did I get the question? Okay, so I mentioned that it's very hard for Israeli-Palestinian solidarity activists to do their work, that they're under attack. They're under attack in many, many different ways. I can give you a very concrete example from this last summer, and you can see it on YouTube for yourself. You might have read during the war in Gaza, I hesitate to call it a war because it really was really more of a massacre than a war, but the military assault in Gaza, there was a widespread support among the Israelis, and most of the polls said a strong majority of Israelis across political lines supported it. But there was a small number of people who were opposed to it, and they were actually very bravely going out and protesting. In Tel Aviv, in particular, they held protests against the war, and they were I don't know any other word for them. There were pogroms. They were physically attacked and beaten in the streets by right-wing Israelis who were roaming around looking for leftists, as they call them, and that to me is probably the most bald and brutal example of this. That they are physically in fear of taking their lives in their own hands by saying these things publicly. They're also pretty much unemployable. My friend Yonatan Shapira, the helicopter pilot who I mentioned, can't find a job. He's basically a pariah in his own country. And I think largely he's seen it as a betrayal because he comes from a very prominent military family. But if you're not going to serve in the army, and the army is at the center of Israeli culture, you are removing yourself really from one of the most important socializing agents in Israeli society, and so you're an outcast. You're unemployable. Your life is very, very difficult. And so those are the kinds of things I was referring to.
Back there.
How do you see the situation 10 or 25 years from now?
How do I see the situation 10 or 25 years from now?
You're asked to be a prophet.
Yeah.
Yeah, big shoes to fill on that one.
I'm actually, I don't know literally what they'll look like. I'm actually optimistic. I think things in the near future are going to get worse. But I think in the longer term, we're going to see progress. I think you can't continue to oppress people who are resisting that, actively resisting that oppression indefinitely. It just can't happen. And I believe that this movement that I've been describing to you is very real and is rooted in a tradition that has a history of effectiveness. And I see people coming around on this issue in my own community that I never would have dreamed. I mean, myself included. that speaks to the power of narrative change, that people are able to accept a new narrative against all odds, and I think changing the hearts of people, as King taught us, is a huge part of the struggle. And I see that narrative starting to change. I think my greatest hope comes from a younger generation, both in the Jewish community but also, around the country. And I know that there was a youth panel, right, not that long ago.
Yep, Tuesday.
Was it in this room?
Yep.
Yeah. So that's ultimately what gives me hope, is that the paradigm is shifting, and it's largely the youth who are our future. I mean, I hope I'm around 25 years from now, but I think the future is in good hands when I look at the people who are going to be the future leaders, or who are actually the leaders now.
I think when I look at this situation, I see that the United States media plays a large role in the perception of other U.S., what the U.S. citizens think about this situation. Do you think that with recent events in the last couple of weeks, that maybe that kind of conversation might start to shift and change in our media, and that might help the general population change their opinion?
Yes, absolutely. I think the media has a very important role in this business of narrative change. I think the challenge is that so much media, especially mainstream media, is corporate owned. And there are many corporations that are benefiting from keeping the status quo where it is. But there are so many different forms of media now that have enormous power. And I see shifts going on in the mainstream media. I read a remarkable piece in the Des Moines Register just recently about 3 amazing young Palestinian women who spoke in this very room. I think the Des Moines Register qualifies as mainstream media, right?
Yeah.
So, I think the answer is yes. I think I see that shift happening even in the most unlikely of places. And I think the role of social media is a huge game changer that most of these movements didn't have in their day, that I think is a really important lever in helping change the narrative.
I'm a live streamer right here in Des Moines, and I have been watching some of the streams from Israel, especially from Tel Aviv. But especially I've seen some that also are working to try to get dignity and respect and freedom for the African Jews who have tried to come to Israel to resettle, to start a new life. Do you see this movement as maybe in the future trying to jack them up a little bit?
Yeah, and it's not only African Jews. I mean, they're African refugees who are, I think most of whom are not Jewish, but are seeking asylum in Israel. And I think, that's connected to the struggle we're seeing here. I think the reaction that you're seeing against the African refugees is part and parcel of a larger popular racism and structural racism that's very real in Israel. And the more we're able to connect those dots, not only within Israel, but in issues of human migration around the world, which are in our own country. You don't need me to tell you that the militarization of ICE in this country, and the reality, the harsh reality for immigrants to this country and undocumented immigrants who live here, is all connected. We're ultimately talking about dismantling structural racism, and the more that we're able to connect those dots, both whether it's within Israel itself or around the world, I think the sooner we'll be able to address the situation more effectively.
We're going to end questions right there. Can we thank Rabbi Rosen
Thank you
again? Thank you so much. We encourage everyone to please sign up for our email list to stay informed. We also encourage everyone to join AFSC's MEPEP, Middle East Peace. I'm going to mix it up with Drake's. They're very similar. But anyway, we have monthly meetings to get involved, stay involved, and support this work. It's so vital here locally as well. And we also have Palestinian olive oil for sale. So thank you everyone once again for coming, and once again for Rabbi Rosen.
Might want to
Chance to mingle before people.
shut it off from the base. Yeah,
Great question. That was a great question.
Yeah, I've been following it. And I love Haaretz. They have done some kick dupa stuff.
They do. They have some.
Yeah.
They have some. But I guess.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to find that in every media organization that's mainstream or, of course, now I'm following what happened to Carmen Aristegui in Mexico City, who was kicked by the network that she was working for.
Oh, yeah.
After 2 of her colleagues were kicked. And, it's politically motivated because she is exposing all the stuff.
Oh, but it was down on the floor. Oh, this is. Oh, somebody's phone.
Yeah, I thought it was on actually, but I checked and it's not hers.
Someone dropped a phone on the floor. It's right here.
Samsung.
Someone missing a Samsung phone? Well, at least we solved that problem.
Yeah, that's great.
You want to say hi to him? Say you saw Ari's daughter?
I can't think of her name though.
I got my stream going still, but I had typed that hoping to pick up any questions from you, the viewers. That's why I typed that, but I do thank you for watching. And again, this is the second time I had streamed Rabbi Rosen, and I don't think this will be the last. He likes Des Moines, obviously. He's going to come back. And he took some great questions from the audience here. So after this, these posters will come down and we'll continue. They'll probably be moving on elsewhere, since this is a month-long exhibit here. And so again, the American Friends Service Committee, the Drake student group that does justice work for Palestine. And this is, I'll have to bend it down and show the light. This is Zafun olive oil from Palestine, and it is probably a very high quality olive oil. I wish I could afford to buy a bottle, but there's a little card on here just about where it comes from. And so that's a little fundraiser that they do, and then part of the proceeds goes back to the growers. So I'm just going to roam around a little bit, maybe pick up the odd conversation. Got another camera person here.
Don't seem to have issues with membership.
Like there's very much a ongoing, like we do like power methods throughout the year and like ways to draw in, and you have a backup way of like it's a plan. So you're always bringing in the members, control.
Oh, I wish I did. I'd buy a bottle.
Yeah.
The small ones are 14, the big ones are 20. So
20.
20 for a big one. Yep, thank you.
All right.
I thought at one time they went up to 20.
They did. They came back down.
Oh, it did. I did not know.
Olive oil is probably one of those volatile commodities that the price can change in a heartbeat, just like rice and sugar and oil and all.
So yeah, I did hear the crude oil.
Yeah,
$50 a barrel.
but it's as volatile as a hot volcano. You are now minus 2 more bottles.
Oh, great. Great. Does he buy them?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
And,
Awesome.
I wish I had the money to buy one, otherwise I would.
Yeah,
I'll have
any
My favorite Christmas present for people.
Love that. That's such a great idea.
I would be. I'd buy it, and I would probably be hesitant to use it. Looks like they're buttoning up here, so I'll probably go ahead and shut down my stream. But in the meantime, before I do that, as I walk around the room, showing some of these posters, please check out my donation sites that are listed below the video view window in my Ustream channel page. If you're watching on Ustream, if you're watching on any Restream channel, you may not see it unless one of the chatters that's watching in Ustream reposts it onto the live stream channel chat. But I have 2 that can be used. GoFundMe, it's www.gofundme.com/OccupierKaylin. That's KAYLYNN. Again, www.gofundme.com/OccupierKaylin. If you cannot access that or you don't have a currency that it uses, you can go through PayPal, which is pretty much available worldwide, minus a few countries, at www.paypal.com. And in the send money to line, enter the email address strainSOP@AOL.com. Again, www.paypal.com. And then send money to line, enter the email address strainSOP@AOL.com. That will help me cover the cost of my live streaming and broadcasting, and maintaining my equipment, and purchasing new things when I have to do that. Like I lost my monopod that I normally use for my phone, so I'm using my one for my tablet, which has an adjustable rubber thing. And and I eat a big data plan, but here I'm pinging off of Wi-Fi, very solid Wi-Fi. I might have had a couple of hiccups, but other than that, it's pretty solid here. This is the best Wi-Fi that I've streamed with. So I do like streaming up here. I haven't tried any other place in this building, but this room is very good. But I do eat a big data plan, and I will be streaming some outdoor events in the near future, and also in places where the Wi-Fi will not be so good, so I'll have to eat data. But again, do kick me a little if you can. But if you cannot, do pass my donation links around, share them, blast them out. Let people know that a streamer could use a little love. And also share my channel, blast my channel out, let people know that I'm streaming here in Des Moines. Right now I'm the only one doing it. I haven't received any requests to train others how to live stream, although I like to do that pretty soon. But again, I could definitely use your help just like all streamers could. So do support streamers and the rebroadcasters, because we are the new media. We do what the mainstream media chooses not to do or chooses to spin. Like you heard the distinction between the Jerusalem Post and Haaretz, a big difference between their journalism styles. One is in your face with the truth, and the other is political spin. And that's what I bring it to you raw. We streamers bring it to you raw. And so my next stream will be on April 1st at noon at the Capitol grounds. And you can go and put this chair on the stack. I was just giving up the chair that I was sitting on, so it can be put on the stack. But anyway, a march against police brutality will be on the Capitol grounds and People's Park, which is the area of the Capitol grounds that Occupy Des Moines named it People's Park because we believe that the Capitol is the people's house, it's the people's area, and doesn't belong to the corporations. And it's the state that just maintains it. So that will be April 1st at noon Central Time. And so for those who do April Fool's Day, no, that will be no April Fool. And there will be some other events coming up after that. So do follow me and get others to jump in. And again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the street.